Okay, in our example today, we are going to work on fiscal policy and how fiscal policy impacts the GDP. So we're going to talk about fiscal policy and the multipliers. There's two multipliers that we have to make sure that we understand when we are dealing with fiscal policy, and those are the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. Now I've put down on the screen here how we calculate each multiplier. So the spending multiplier is always going to be 1 divided by the MPS. Now remember, the MPS represents the marginal propensity to save. And when we do that and calculate the spending multiplier, that is going to give us a number that we are going to multiply by any amount that is spent in our economy to determine how much the GDP is going to change. Now, because taxing and spending happen in different ways, we also have a tax multiplier, and the tax multiplier is always going to be the MPC, marginal propensity to consume, divided by the MPS. Now, if you don't like the idea of trying to remember two different ways to calculate multipliers, just remember that the tax multiplier will always be one number less than the spending multiplier. So if you look at our example, in an economy where we have the MPS as 0.8, and the MPS is 0.2, and the MPC is 0.8. You can look below and you can see that in that scenario, the spending multiplier would be 1 divided by 0.2, which equals 5. And the tax multiplier then is 1 less. It's going to be 4. And that will always be the case. Your tax multiplier will always be one number less than the spending multiplier. So let's do some calculations and see how these spending and tax multipliers work. So if we look at our first example here, we have an increase in government spending that is equal to $100 million. Well, we know that that $100 million is going to go into the economy and it's going to increase the GDP by 100 million. But we also know that that 100 million is going to multiply and increase the GDP by more than the initial amount spent based on the multiplier theory that we talked about in Unit 3. So I'm going to take this 100 million and I'm going to multiply that by the spending multiplier, because it's an increase in government spending, which we know is 5 in this scenario. And that tells me that when our government spends $100 million, it is going to multiply to increase the GDP by a maximum of $500 million. So it would be a $500 million increase in GDP. Okay? And if we do the same thing with the change in taxes, we're going to see that the change in taxes has a little bit less of an impact on the economy than the change in spending. So I take my $100 million, that's the amount that we were decreasing in taxes. That means that we're giving people across our country $100 million more to spend, okay, collectively as a group. So we take that 100 million, we're going to times it by our tax multiplier, which is 1 less than the spending multiplier of 4, and that tells me that our GDP is going to increase by $400 million. Increase GDP. So the big thing for us to know here is that anytime we have a change in taxes and a change in spending, because the multipliers are different from one another, we should automatically know that the change in spending will have a greater impact on change in the GDP than the change in taxes does. And so for that reason, we need to make sure we understand that those concepts are different. Both are going to have a multiplying impact on the GDP, but spending will always multiply by more than the change in taxes.